I am observing in these hours a development that goes far beyond a scandalous document dump. The release of 3.5 million pages from the Epstein files by the US Department of Justice on January 30, 2026 marks not only another blow against Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, but also exposes the structural vulnerability of one of the world's oldest monarchical institutions. What I recognize in the photographs and email correspondences is the visible collapse of a system that for centuries was based on discretion, privilege protection, and institutional immunity. The newly released images showing Andrew Mountbatten Windsor in a compromising position over an unidentified woman, as well as the email correspondence between an account named The Duke and Jeffrey Epstein from 2010, document more than personal misconduct. They reveal the extent to which the British Crown became entangled in a network that is now regarded as a paradigmatic example of global elite corruption. I am analysing here the moment in which the firewall between the monarchical institution and individual misconduct finally collapses. This crisis developed over years as a structural problem of a monarchy that must redefine its justification for existence in the 21st century. I recognise in Andrew's connections to Epstein a symptomatic example of the kind of privileged network politics that has been undermining Britain's soft power for decades. The emails from 2010 show Epstein attempting to introduce Andrew to a 26-year-old Russian woman 2 years after Epstein's first guilty plea for soliciting minors. Andrew responded enthusiastically and asked for additional information about the woman. What I am observing here is the systematic erosion of the monarchical myth through a toxic combination of aristocratic arrogance and global networking with problematic actors. The fact that in 2010, 1 month after Epstein's house arrest, Andrew offered a dinner at Buckingham Palace with plenty of privacy documents an institutional failure at the highest level. At that point, the Crown already possessed all the information necessary to recognise the danger, yet chose continuity over control. King Charles III took a historically unprecedented step in October 2025 when he stripped his brother of all royal titles and effectively expelled him from the institution. This decision, however, was not proactive but reactive, a damage control measure after Virginia Giuffre's posthumous memoirs and earlier document releases had already caused irreparable harm. I recognize in this delayed response the classic pattern of an institution that still believes it can survive crises through waiting them out and gradual distancing. The geopolitical implications of these revelations extend far beyond the British Isles. I analyze 3 central actors whose power positions are fundamentally altered by this development. The British monarchy faces a legitimacy problem that calls into question its role as a stabilizing factor in British politics and as a symbol of the special relationship with the United States. Charles III finds himself in the paradoxical position of having to reform an institution built on tradition and continuity. His decision to remove Andrew was calculated damage control, but the new documents suggest that this measure may have come too late. The monarchy is systematically losing its function as a moral authority, a loss that is particularly devastating in a time of growing social inequality and political instability. The US Department of Justice acts in this context as a powerful external actor, exerting pressure on British institutions through selective information disclosure. The fact that these documents were released under the Trump administration despite Trump himself appearing in the files points to a complex domestic political calculation. I recognize in the manner and timing of these releases a deliberate demonstration of power toward traditional allies, fitting into a new American paradigm of global dominance. The international public, and especially the German media following this story, are witnessing a fundamental shift in geopolitical symbolic politics. What could once be dismissed as private misconduct has now become a test of the credibility of Western democracies and their ability to enforce elite accountability. I recognize in this phase a critical acceleration of already existing trends. The Epstein files function as a catalyst for a legitimacy crisis encompassing 3 different levels. At the institutional level, the British monarchy loses its role as a stabilizing factor in the political system. The revelations come at a time when Britain is already grappling with the consequences of Brexit, economic stagnation, and social polarization. A discredited monarchy amplifies this instability and removes a traditional consensus anchor of British society. At the diplomatic level, transatlantic relations are shaped by a new asymmetry. Through these document releases, the United States demonstrates its ability to compromise even its closest allies through controlled information leaks. This marks a paradigm shift from partnership-based to dominance-based alliance politics. At the symbolic level, these revelations represent the collapse of the idea that elites can live by different moral standards than ordinary citizens. The global networking of privileged circles, which for decades formed the foundation of Western soft power, is increasingly recognized as systemic corruption. The coming months will show whether this crisis can be contained or whether it will trigger an avalanche of further revelations. I identify 3 critical escalation points. First, further document releases will follow. The US Department of Justice has made it clear that the 3.5 million pages from January represent only a portion of the available material. Each new release has the potential to compromise additional high-ranking actors and further destabilize the transatlantic alliance system. Second, pressure on Andrew to testify before US investigators will intensify. His continued silence is becoming increasingly untenable while American politicians publicly criticize his refusal to cooperate. A forced testimony would expose not only him personally, but also the institution of the monarchy to further revelations. Third, domestic political tensions in the United Kingdom will intensify. The Labour government under Keir Starmer cannot afford to act as a shield for a discredited monarchy while simultaneously relying on American cooperation in other areas. I project 3 plausible scenarios for further developments. In the first scenario, the monarchy succeeds in partially restoring its legitimacy through radical transparency and institutional reforms. This would require full disclosure of all connections to problematic networks and a redefinition of the monarchical role. The probability of this scenario decreases with every new revelation. In the second scenario, the loss of legitimacy accelerates and leads to a constitutional crisis in the United Kingdom. Regionally autonomous movements in Scotland and Wales could exploit this weakness to intensify their independence efforts. The monarchy would become a destabilizing factor within the British state structure. In the third scenario, other major powers, especially China and Russia, instrumentalize this crisis to delegitimize Western values and institutions. The Epstein affair would become a permanent propaganda tool against the Western value system, while authoritarian regimes simultaneously proclaim their own moral superiority. I recognize in these revelations a turning point for the entire Anglo-Saxon power architecture. The Five Eyes alliance, which has served as the backbone of Western intelligence cooperation since World War II, faces an unprecedented crisis of trust. If the United States is willing to dismantle the British monarchy through selective information leaks, this signals a fundamental realignment of American hegemonic strategy. I analyze 3 concrete effects on the global balance of power. First, rising powers such as China and India will exploit this weakness to consolidate their own spheres of influence. Beijing has already begun using the Epstein affair as an example of Western hypocrisy, skillfully framing its own authoritarian practices as more honest. Second, London loses its traditional role as an intermediary between Washington and continental Europe. The EU will increasingly need to develop direct channels to the United States, while the United Kingdom is relegated to junior partner status. Third, Russia gains a strategic window to further undermine transatlantic solidarity. Moscow possesses its own compromising material on Western elites and can now deploy it in a calculated manner to exacerbate internal NATO tensions. The asymmetry between American information dominance and British vulnerability creates new blackmail potentials that revisionist powers will systematically exploit. What I observe in the manner in which these documents were released is the birth of a new paradigm of geopolitical control. The US Department of Justice effectively acts as an information hegemon, disciplining allied nations through selective transparency. This method surpasses traditional diplomacy in effectiveness, as it causes irreversible reputational damage while maintaining the appearance of legal legitimacy. I recognize here a revolutionary development. The United States has created a system that allows it to control allies without imposing formal sanctions or damaging diplomatic relations. The threat of further revelations becomes a silent weapon of American foreign policy. The United Kingdom now finds itself in a position of permanent vulnerability, a status fundamentally incompatible with its historical role as an equal partner. This dynamic will extend to other American allies. Germany, France, Japan, and other core partners must assume that Washington possesses similarly compromising information and will instrumentalize it when necessary. The result is an alliance structure no longer based on mutual trust but on asymmetric dependence. The crisis of the British monarchy is already manifesting in measurable economic distortions. I observe a gradual erosion of trust in British institutions reflected in capital outflows and declining foreign direct investment. London's role as a global financial centre was partly based on the myth of British institutional stability and legal certainty. This foundation is systematically eroding. Sterling is losing significance relative to other reserve currencies, while international investors are evaluating alternative locations for their European strategies. Frankfurt, Paris, and Amsterdam benefit from this redistribution, while London develops a structural competitive disadvantage. I predict that these trends will intensify in the coming years, especially if further revelations follow. At the same time, the United Kingdom's dependence on American financial markets and technology corporations is increasing. This asymmetry becomes the economic foundation of the new political subordination. British companies must increasingly comply with American compliance standards, while British regulatory authorities effectively cede their sovereignty to US institutions. What I recognize in these developments is more than the fall of a single individual or institution. It is the collapse of a system of global elite networks that operated in the shadows for centuries and is now exposed to the merciless light of digital transparency. The Epstein files document not only individual misconduct, but the systematic corruption of an entire class of actors who believed themselves to be above the laws they created for others. The British monarchy stands as an emblematic example of institutions that derived their legitimacy from tradition and discretion. In a world of total surveillance and selective transparency, such institutions become anachronisms or instruments in the hands of those who control information. I recognize in this moment the beginning of a new phase of global governance, in which traditional sovereignty is replaced by information dominance. Nation-states are no longer controlled through military occupation or economic sanctions, but through the permanent threat of compromising revelations. This method is more efficient, less costly, and politically more sustainable than traditional power projection. This crisis marks the end of an era in which elite networks function through mutual compromise and silent consensus. What follows is a new world order in which information becomes the ultimate currency of power, and traditional institutions survive only as long as they serve the interests of digital hegemonic powers. I observe the emergence of a post-Westphalian system in which formal sovereignty is replaced by informal control. The Epstein files are not merely a legal document, they are the blueprint for a new form of imperial rule operating through information asymmetry rather than territorial control. The case of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a new, far more unstable phase of global power politics in which every nation, every institution, and every elite is permanently exposed to the risk of selective destruction through controlled transparency. What we are witnessing is nothing less than the birth of a digital empire that overshadows all previous forms of hegemonic control.